This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. It's episode 733, and this week we welcome Dr. David Krause. We're going to talk about the remediation of microbial contamination and Legionella. We have wanted to get Dr. Krause on the show for a long time now, and the stars have lined up, so let's get started. But before we do, we want to thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. And after the show, you can continue the discussion on afterthoughts.iaqradio.com. IAQ Radio Association sponsors are AIHA, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, at aiha.org. IICRC, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, at iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at restorationindustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at eia-usa.org. Actionable Insights at getinsights.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus at particlesplus.com. BioPlanet at byoplanet.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. Name both the International Fraternity and the U.S. Military Veterans Association that both experienced outbreaks of Legionnaires' disease while meeting in the same place. Back to you, Joe.
All right. Dr. David Krause is the founder of Healthcare Consulting and Contracting, HC3. He's a certified industrial hygienist and toxicologist with 30 years of experience in public health, occupational hazard assessments, and indoor air quality. As part of his long career during the 2008 to 2011 years, Dr. Krause served as the State Toxicologist for the Florida Department of Health. Welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you, Joe.
It's been too long. We've been trying. I don't know why I haven't had you on sooner, but it's great that, when I saw your name on that remediation chapter of the bioaerosols book, I was like, okay, I got to get this done.
Yeah. You probably looked at it and said, oh my God, what is this guy got to say now?
Well, there's some interesting things in there, I must say, although I don't think it's changed too much from the old version, but there are some changes. We'll get into that. Before we do, if you've had a long career over the years here in indoor air quality and occupational health, tell us a little bit about your path through this industry and your thoughts on the current state of occupational health and indoor, how IAQ fits into that.
Yeah. I kind of came into the industry from an odd point. I graduated with a biology degree from Florida State back in '89, and went into the artillery units in Germany as a commissioned officer overseas for about 4 years. And there I kind of got stuck into, instead of getting to shoot big guns all the time, they assigned me to the largest brigade in the Army that nobody knew about. So it was called the 59th Ordnance Brigade, and all we dealt with were atomic and chemical weapons. So I kind of showed up at the end of that heyday in Europe, and my main job there was, I'll say security, maintenance, operations, and in the end, returning them back to the U.S. So I kind of got indoctrinated into handling extremely hazardous, dangerous, and things that go boom devices early in my career. So as a 27-year-old captain, I ended up getting out of the Army after dealing with all the chemical and atomic weapons, getting them out of Europe. We removed them all from Europe back to the States. And with that resume, what do you do back in the civilian world? So some colleagues of mine said, "Hey, you ought to try out for this job at the Department of Health. They have a position open for an industrial hygienist." And I said, "Well, what is that?" And turns out I could be one. And at the time, the state toxicologist, Roger Inman, who turned out to be a wonderful mentor of mine and kind of kicked my butt to make me go back to grad school. He was the state toxicologist, and he had been previously the Air Force toxicologist. And he pushed me into doing this, set up the indoor air program for the entire state of Florida, set up programs throughout most of the counties. And we covered, in the first year, we had over 5,000 responses, requests for assistance back in '94. And I got to do the training and education, the equipment, the grants, getting people set up at the county health department levels, guys like Bob Colati and a number of others, Mike Loudermilk at the county health departments, who really back in the early and mid '90s helped establish that program. And that kind of got me moving into this. I was an industrial hygienist for public health, and you know,
what were the main concerns back in the mid '90s when people would call the state?
Well, we actually had a state statute that required the Department of Health, and is still there, to respond to requests for assistance on indoor air quality. At the time, I think I had a $750,000 a year budget that served tens of thousands of people every year and their assistants. Now the budget is zero, and they got one guy who responds to questions, but doesn't do anything in the field. So those programs have been pretty much gutted. But yeah, back then it was, the issues of mold and pulmonary hemosiderosis in children. We started seeing the issues with aromatic candles and black soot deposition. That eventually led on to my master's research on candle emissions and exposures to carcinogens and lead from burning certain candles. Certainly dealing with dust mites, allergens, the impacts of building infiltration. That's when Joe Stiebrick was really doing a lot of his presentations and changing the minds of how people build buildings in Florida. Like we were doing it inside out, apparently. So yeah, it was an interesting time. Worked with Richard Shaughnessy and Bill Turner. Learned a lot from those guys. Terry Brennan. Worked with a ton of folks down there that I learned from, and then eventually kind of got pushed off to go to graduate school and a little bit different work.
Yeah, it's interesting that they have a statute that they have to respond, but I guess the way you don't follow the statute is just don't fund it.
Exactly. Well, it's hilarious. They will have a statute, and they will give the responsibility to an agency, and then the agency then has to request budget to do the work. And then they may or may not budget it. And then if it's actually in the budget, then you have to get a legislative budget request to actually spend the money that has been put into your budget to spend. So you have to ask for that money 3 times.
Wow. Crazy. Well, you and Jack Springston are cited. He's a good friend of the show, cited as the authors of the Remediation of Microbial Contamination chapter in the new CIH Bioaerosols 2nd edition. Tell our audience a little bit about what's new, if anything, other than the addition of Legionella, which we're going to talk a lot about as time goes on.
Good. Well, I really appreciate Jack roping me into helping him with the chapter on remediation. That was a big honor. The original chapter had been drafted by Richard Shaughnessy and Phil Morey. I luckily got a chance to work with Phil quite a bit towards the end of his career when he was working with Environ, which is now Ramboll. So a big honor to work there, to work on that chapter. And then also worked on the bacteria chapter, which has a lot of basics and fundamental information that was originally authored by Harriet Birch. And Dr. Birch was, for a while before she retired, on my doctoral committee. So it was a big, a big honor to be able to I'll say update her work as well. So Jack and I have been I'll say good colleagues since we really started working together on the AIHA Legionella guideline back in 2013, 2014. He was very, very helpful, and he led the effort on, I'll say, the initial drafting. I kind of lit the fire under the need for integrating guidance on Legionella and waterborne pathogens. Having done this long enough, and Jack practices a lot in Legionnaires disease as well. So those cases, so he's certainly on board with that. So we expanded it to meet what we think is not just the past issues, but the future.
Yeah, there's quite a bit on Legionella. Let's start with some bullet points that define microbial contamination, which it's still pretty heavy on mold contamination, I think you would agree. But you try to cover everything in there. Biologicals are likely to cause or predispose health effects. Inappropriate airborne concentrations is mentioned in there, and indoor microbial growth, amplification, or remnants, which may become aerosolized. So I see aerosolized a few times. But on the other hand, it seems to discourage air sampling, but maybe I'm reading that wrong. Can you straighten me out on that?
That definition didn't change. I don't think we changed a word or anything in that definition. And if you look at it from a 50,000 foot level, it is intended to be an all-encompassing definition. That could be applied to dust mites, it could be applied to mold, it could be applied to viruses, it could be applied to any of those. And it is, it kind of hedges its bets. The first two bullets, I think, really kind of fall into the theoretical, or maybe we'll know this someday. What is an inappropriate concentration? Well, it depends. Depends on the infectious dose of the agent, the size of the particles it's carrying on, and the susceptibility of the individual. So that's a bit of an idealistic definition. The last one is really the last bullet. The amplification, the growth, the increase in concentrations, the colonization of that environment by microbial agents is really where 99% of all the practice really lives, and
or should live, I guess.
The airborne concentrations realistically are transient. They come and they go. It's like trying to determine if your sprinkler system is working by measuring the amount of water at an arbitrary time of the day when it may or may not be operating. So, that what's, floating around in the air, what's being thrown around at this very moment may or may not reflect the presence of a sprinkler system or microbial contamination, or whether it's impacting that environment. Sometimes you can just step back and look to see, okay, I got dry spots in my yard. This area is getting is growing stuff really well. And that's a better and more reliable metric or determinant of contamination, is whether or not you're growing things. It's that activity that I think we can really hang our hat on. Sometimes when you're doing air sampling, you'll catch it. Sometimes you won't. And that's the biggest problem that I have with relying upon that as a metric.
And it also says that surface samples capable of detecting the presence of fungal growth structures, viable and pathogenic bacteria, or endotoxin levels are most useful in defining the extent of microbial contaminated building surfaces and materials. It's a mouthful, but essentially saying surface samples are the way to go.
Yeah.
That seems to be the theme of the chapter. Would you agree?
It's certainly where we've encouraged people to go. We often see, and Jack was certainly, I think, on board with this as well. We see people using the air sampling technologies and methodologies far beyond their capabilities. I've done a lot of air sampling. I've done a lot of air sampling for chemicals. biological, radiological agents. Biological agents are more difficult than any of them. You know, they are tricky. They don't behave. They don't follow the directions. They they are persistent and pernicious, and we often have a lot of errors that we put into the process and how we collect the samples, how we hold the samples, how we ship the samples, how we analyze the samples, how we report the samples. So, there's a lot of error that gets pushed into that. And ultimately what you want to know is what's going on in this environment. Is this a safe environment? Is this a healthy environment? Is it a clean environment? Or is it one that is harboring contamination? Well, you can define contamination as growth. Now, that may be growth of square centimeter of mold. And by its strictest definition, we could call that contamination, right? Is it significant? No. A square centimeter, a square meter, 1,000 square meters. Okay, so the magnitude is important. Where does the growth begin and where does it end? And as a remediator, frankly, you don't care what the airborne concentrations are. You care about getting the surfaces clean. You're not cleaning the air. I mean, the air can be cleaned without even touching the surface. So, the remediation, what we're attempting to do is remove the contaminant from that environment. And to measure the airborne concentrations, I would proffer that 9 times out of 10, you could pass clearance criteria before you ever cleaned a single surface if you took the samples in a certain way. So if that's a possibility, then maybe that's not the best metric for successful cleaning or remediation of that environment.
Curious what, with mold, it's pretty easy to see. Well, I shouldn't say there are times when you don't see the actual growth very well, but more often than not, you're dealing with visible mold. You can see it. You can take a sample of it, a tape lift. But when you're dealing with bacteria, can you give our audience an example of when they should want to check for pathogenic bacteria and maybe even endotoxin levels, which I saw mentioned as well? Have you had to do this, and maybe you can give us an example?
Yeah. So most of the time we're dealing with pathogenic bacteria related to sewage spills or some type of, sometimes even a terrorist action, as we were dealing with anthrax. With waterborne pathogens, which are part and parcel with indoor environments, whether it's coming from the shower or the water heater or a decorative water feature in the middle of a lobby. So those are the places where you find those pathogens and things that can cause human infection. Endotoxins are really interesting because, of course, they're a component that's produced by all gram-negative bacteria. And we often think about them as, okay, they're released when the bacteria dies. Okay, that's what we're always told. But it's not that clear-cut. So even when the bacteria are living, they extrude a small concentration into the surrounding environment of these lipopolysaccharides, this part of their cell wall components. When they die and are lysed, they released about 20 times more. So even when you've got gram-negative bacteria growing either in your carpet or in some really wet material or water itself, that endotoxin is a great indicator and straightforward way to measure it, and is also a chemical hazard in and of itself. It can cause adverse human health effects. I don't know if you know this, but recently CIH just released and approved a TLV for endotoxins. And now endotoxins, that brings it with it a lot of issues, and there was some controversy even within CIH. It's out there now. And we typically rely upon a holistic measure of what we call endotoxin activity. The biological activity is measured in endotoxin units, because some endotoxins are really, really potent and some are not so potent. And really what you're measuring is the aggregate impact or potency that those toxins have on a living organism, usually what we call its pyrogenicity, its ability to induce a fever. So you're measuring the aggregate impact. So you could have a little highly potent toxin or a lot of a low potent toxin, and they could be equal. And that's really what matters anyway. It doesn't cause an infection. But those cause humidifier fever, Pontiac fever, which is a form of legionellosis. You know, we don't see it diagnosed very often, but we do know it's a major problem that can happen in many indoor environments. So I have had to measure endotoxins in the air and in the carpeting in office buildings that were, I'll say, inappropriately maintained, had long-standing water intrusion, water damage. There was one building, a state agency that we were doing remediation oversight on their HVAC systems, which had, you know, fuzzy green stuff growing throughout. And on a Friday afternoon, we watched the maintenance crews doing the carpet cleaning. And I could, the Zamboni type machine they were using to walk through the halls and clean the carpet, it was leaving so much water in the carpet you could hear them splashing like they were walking through puddles. And of course, at the end of the day, it's a Friday afternoon, Florida, they turn off the HVAC system, leave probably 20 gallons of water in the hallways and go home. And the endotoxin levels in that carpet were off the charts. They were dirtier than dirt. I mean, we went out and collected soil from the surrounding ground, and it was 2 orders of magnitude less than what was in their carpet. So not normal, not appropriate, and drove the need for, you know, remediating, abating their carpet as well.
Well, are there any special methods used to abate something that's got a lot of endotoxin, or is it just the same as we do with, you know, mold remediation? Or
it has to be removal. Endotoxin is very heat stable. It actually survives autoclaving. So anything that you're going to do to try to denature it or destroy it will probably destroy the material you're trying to salvage. The difficulty with endotoxin, and it's just a simple vacuum, you know, dust sample that you have extracted. So it's how much endotoxin per gram of dust. The problem is the more dust you remove, the ratio doesn't change. The same amount of endotoxin is still going to be in the same amount of dust. So you may remove, you know, if you remove 20 pounds of dust out of, or dirt and debris out of the carpet, and you still have a pound in there, you go back and collect it, you're not changing the concentration. So it becomes a very difficult thing to know if you've effectively removed it. Essentially, what you end up doing is getting down to non-detectable levels based upon the amount of dust that you get out of the carpet.
You know, we've got a lot of restoration guys that listen to the show, and I'm wondering, do you ever get involved in helping to determine if there's a difference, you know, if there is a category 1 versus a category 3 moisture issue in a building, you know, especially after you know, flooding or after maybe rain goes into a building? There's a difference between the remediation work they do, when it's category 1 versus category 3 water. Do you get involved in that?
Usually 2 to 3 years after the fact when there's a lawsuit. So
Okay.
rarely do they call me while the disaster is in you know, underway. But yeah, I do that all the time. And you know, dealing with bacteria, it's pretty straightforward. Often you're looking for even just presence or absence of viable, you know, fecal coliform, total E. coli or total coliform. But it's often the other bacteria and the actinomycetes that are really the big health hazards there. We often don't even look for those. They're more difficult to measure, monitor, detect, and report. But yeah, I get involved with that all the time. But then the question is, what level of effort is necessary to bring it back to, I'll say, clean status? And that's often where we do get into disagreements with, you know, what needs to be done to take care of it. You know, I've had other, you know, licensed professionals tell me, well, that's good enough. You know, it's good enough just to make it visibly clean, and then coat over that material. And in many instances, I wouldn't necessarily call that remediation. It may be cleaning, it may be management in place, maybe mitigating exposure, but using biocides on porous materials, using coating agents outside of their labeled approved application. Just in my experience, has a higher chance of failure. I come behind these projects quite frequently and see, I'll say, half measures used in remediation and see failed remediations. So that's the filter with which I look through the world.
Joe, if I may, yeah, from a remediation standpoint, you were talking about, endotoxin before, and the need to remove the carpet because, it's not to be easily remediated. And, same thing in a sewage situation, you're going to remove porous materials. However, in both of those situations, we could have concrete or cement underneath. And what about that? Because I think in a restoration situation, this guy's going to have to decide, can we, clean and sanitize, or, what can be done with the cement?
I rarely have any concerns about cleaning, sanitizing hard, non-porous surfaces.
Okay, gotcha.
Now you can get some chemical absorption into concrete, which can be problematic. I've seen that in many cases. But yeah, if you get down to the terrazzo or the tile or the concrete, unless you're dealing with something like PCBs or formaldehyde containing products, which can absorb into the product, into the surface, and then re-emit later. But yeah, it's entirely that's great if you can do that. And I usually end up requiring the disinfection or treatment of the concrete.
And that, I think that answered the question in the text too. So if not, let us know, Ralph. I wanted to ask you about, there's a lot of people that are influenced by things on, Facebook and so on and so forth. And there's a group of doctors that are pretty adamant about evaluating microbial issues by looking for mycotoxins, et cetera, and maybe even glucans, which we talked with Dr. Miller about a couple of weeks ago now, maybe 3-4 weeks ago. But are there any special remediation techniques for things like glucans or mycotoxins or endotoxin? Is it just simply cleaning, doing thorough cleaning?
I'd say, yes, doing thorough cleaning, bulk removal of hyphal mycelia from the indoor environment is the meat ended of mold remediation. On the issue of mycotoxins, so for my doctoral research, I actually ended up doing my research on fungal growth on building materials and some of the unique aspects of Stachybotrys shatarum growth on gypsum drywall, Aspergillus versicolor and fiberglass ductboard. So I looked at, chamber studies and what it takes for them to grow and how they decompose and degrade those materials. But prior to that, I'd actually looked at doing a study looking at detoxification of mycotoxin producing fungi prior to abatement or remediation to reduce the risk to the remediation contractors.
Okay.
And before you ever start doing that research in the academic field, you're going to start doing a literature review. So you're going to do a deep dive into the history of everything written about this. And one of the interesting things, looking back into the late 20s, early 30s on Stachybotrys and the mycotoxins produced by that, there was outbreaks in Poland and at the time, I guess, Soviet Union. Of Stachybotrys toxicosis related to hay in horses and other livestock. And these guys, brilliant at the time, they figured out a way to salvage that hay was by ammonia fumigation. So they would basically heat, boil ammonia, and let the fumes come up through the haystacks, and found that that would make the straw that had been contaminated by Stachybotrys growth into something that the horses would eat and wouldn't kill them. So kudos to them. I don't know that ammonia fumigation is a tolerable way to remediate a home these days, but there's a technique. Honestly, when I started looking at the conditions necessary for significant amount of toxins to be produced by Stachybotrys, Fusarium, any number of these, mesophilic, the wet-loving fungi, they need three things. They need, well, four. They need the right genes. They need to be a toxigenic strain, one that's capable of producing toxins. Then they need to grow at modest temperatures, usually fairly high temperatures, on a high nutrient substrate. So corn, wheat, straw, hay, rice, something that's packed full of energy. And it needs to be very wet, but not completely saturated. Then it needs to go through a series of temperature cycles. So we would run into, you would see it go, 70, 80 degrees, then close to freezing, and then back up, and then back down. And that cycling seems to, and no one could ever figure out, or no one's reported that I've seen the reason for it, but that seems to induce toxin production by these fungi. And so, what they were seeing in Poland and in Russia during that period were a very wet spring, where they would have swings in temperature and a lot of rain, and the hay would get wet. And that seemed to result in this, and they were able to reproduce this in the laboratory. So ultimately, I decided not to go down that path for my research, because I saw that the conditions that you find in a house in Boca Raton or Atlanta, Georgia, they don't have that high nutrient source. I mean, gypsum drywall is great, but it's not something you want to try to raise your kids on. You don't have these massively wet conditions that are, then hot and then cold and hot and then cold. Now, you may have some microenvironments where that happens, but it's just not the right thing. And then when you start looking at the research studies where they're talking about measuring levels of these mycotoxins in samples from a home, and they're not talking about milligrams, they're not talking about micrograms, they're not talking about nanograms, they're talking about picograms.
Yeah.
I mean, these are infinitesimally small levels that are being measured. And that did not, in my opinion, extrapolate into a human health risk under most conditions. There's always the oddball case. I've certainly seen some where I suspect mycotoxins were an issue. But it's been a handful of times out of 30 years. And the visible mold growth there was so obvious that it should have been handled anyway. So our major source of exposure to mycotoxins in today's environment is from our food. And finding mycotoxins in somebody's blood or their urine or their bodies should not surprise anybody, because we eat peanuts and corn and foodstuffs that have small levels of mycotoxins, and our bodies can generally handle it. It's been something we've probably been exposed to throughout our entire evolution. So I don't see that mycotoxins I see them mostly used to scare people to death and spend exorbitant amounts of money. I talk people off the ledge all the time about, worrying about mycotoxins and their impact on their homes and their lives. Mold shouldn't be growing indoors, period.
Yeah. I'm glad I asked. That's interesting. All right, we're going to go to halftime. Thank our sponsors. We'll be back with the second half of our interview with Dr. David Krause. Our association sponsors are AIHA, Healthy Workplaces, A Healthier World, AIHA.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA's multidisciplinary membership collects, generates, and disseminates information concerning environmental and occupational health hazards in the built environment at EIA-USA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, IICRC.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit professional trade association dedicated to providing leadership and promoting best practices through advocacy, standards, and professional qualifications for the restoration industry at restorationindustry.org. Actionable insights, no more mistakes, no more missed line items in your Xactimate estimates at getinsights.org. Industry sponsors are Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. BioPlanet at byoplanet.com, improving human, animal, and environmental health with electrostatic spray technology and advanced chemistries at byoplanet.com. All right, we're back with the second half of our interview with Dr. David Krause. Cliff, I want to make sure we covered everything you wanted to cover in that remediation. I've got a couple I'll bring back for the roundup, but I want to get into Legionella because I know that was a big addition to the bioaerosols book here, at least in the remediation section. I don't recall how much was in the original version. Do you recall? I don't.
Well, in my recollection, when I was reviewing the original text, Legionella was used quite often as an exemplar, an example, here's an example of a bacteria that can cause problems. But they practically spoke nothing about it. I mean, there was no guidance on it. It was barely mentioned, and appropriately so. If you can think this document was probably written over, 97, 98, published in 99. At that point in time, we were probably dealing with right around 1,000 cases per year of confirmed Legionnaires disease in the US, and it hadn't really changed much in 20 years. 2002 to 2003, it jumped 70% nationwide. Most of that was attributed to a 360% change in the Pennsylvania, Maryland, mid-Atlantic coast area. After that, the CDC in a report, in an article they published, which I think should be actually retracted, they did a review of that data and concluded that, well, it wasn't testing, it wasn't increased surveillance, it wasn't an artifact of how we count the cases, that it was due to an increased level of rain in the year of 2003. Well, I actually went back and looked at the data on that and realized that, well, actually 2002 had been a low rain event year, and 2003 was a little bit higher. But frankly, ever since 2003, the rate of increase in cases has gone through the roof. It has continued to rise. Despite droughts, despite high rain levels, it's not been relevant. And so their conclusion, I think, has in retrospect, or in the rearview mirror, not held water. Pardon the pun. But what did happen in 2002 was the implementation of the Safe Drinking Water Act disinfectant byproduct rule. So the one thing that we do know is that disinfectant levels in municipal water help protect against bacteria, including Legionella. That was the first year that they said, okay, the byproducts, which are carcinogenic, created by chlorine in water, they can't be above a certain level. Well, in order to not hit that level, you either remove a lot of organic matter from the water, which is an expensive filtration process, or you put in less chlorine. And so what I've seen since that period is a reduction in chlorine levels across the country. And so that I think is probably the biggest contributor to Legionnaire's disease increase in across the country, and it's gone up over 650% in 15 years. That is not a resounding success. The number of cases, it peaked in 2018 at just under 10,000 confirmed cases. So we went from less than around 1,000 cases a year to 10,000 cases.
Big.
That's a big difference. It's not a success thing.
No, not at all. Could it be part that the water system, the lines that carry water through our buildings, get old. They get filth. The diagram in the book just like kind of it struck me as like, wow, there's a diagram in here for those that aren't familiar with the book that shows a pipe, the cross section of a pipe, and on the is all this biofilm associated bacteria and secreted slime, and then the water's kind of flowing through the middle third of the pipe, and the top third is probably, it looks like might be air even in there. And I think of the pipes here at Indian Lake, which when they flush them, it comes out brown, nasty gunk like regularly. Could it possibly be that it's in the pipes?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's probably very little Legionella leaving the municipal water supply. And if there is, it's kind of got its feelings hurt by the chemical treatments. But every time you have a water main break, every time you have a construction, additional pipes, even nearby construction, heavy equipment, shaking loose the debris, scale, sediment, all that material goes downstream, and typically there's no more chlorine or disinfectant that's being added to the lines once it leaves the municipal supply plant. So it essentially goes untreated until it hits the building. And then we're finding less and less and often no detectable chlorine or monochloramine at the meter, at the backflow preventer coming into the building. So unless you're adding disinfectant into your building, which you're not supposed to do, not by current laws, you can't do it by yourself. You have the bugs have a free reign once they're inside the building. And if the conditions are right, then yeah, they can begin growing, amplifying, and potentially reach infectious levels.
But now, let me make sure I understand this. So, but drinking that water, I don't think I'm going to have a problem. It's when you inhale some of the I don't know what you would call it, but the aerosols. Thank you. Taking a shower, for instance, or in a hot tub, or those are the most common I would think of. Is that accurate to say?
How about washing your hands?
Okay.
Washing the dishes at the sink. Washing your car with the garden hose outside.
But yet I don't see reports of people getting Legionnaire's disease in residential facilities. Am I just not seeing that, or is it just less common than in commercial buildings? What's going on there?
Striking number. 96%. 96% of the cases of Legionnaire's disease, which are diagnosed very specific test methods, are never investigated, sampled, or evaluated for their source. So the current paradigm established by CSTEs, the Council for State and Territorial Epidemiologists, these are kind of like an AIHA for epidemiologists, and it has been adopted by all the states and the feds at the CDC, is that you only do environmental investigations, sampling, if you have 2 or more cases, and 2 or more cases are what they call an outbreak.
Okay.
So only 4 to 5% of cases every year nationwide have that nexus where you have two or more people who were at the same place and time and had disease soon thereafter. Okay. So it's only where they have that nexus do public health officials even feel it's even worthwhile to go look. And still they often don't find the sources. But still, most cases, and I have seen residential cases, I've done residential outbreaks in apartments and homes, and it happens. And, single individual cases do not breach the threshold for public health to carry out an investigation.
Cliff, I want to make sure I get you a chance to jump in here, because I know you had a couple of questions on this topic.
On Legionella, yeah. I guess, one of the things that struck me when we were interviewing Jack was this concept that you came up with, that chlorine only tickled bacteria, and that, pH and conditioning and so on and so forth. So if you could comment on that, I think the audience would appreciate it.
Sure. Well, we know that, all right, so Legionella is what I call one of the big 3. And we know about it because it's a nationally notifiable disease because of the outbreaks that happened in 1976, which prompted its inclusion there. But when we look at actual healthcare costs and the number of pneumonias caused by similar types of organisms, Pseudomonas is number 2, and NTMs, or it's a group of organisms that are similar to tuberculosis, but they're called non-tuberculous mycobacteria. These 3 together cost over $3 billion a year in healthcare costs. So, yeah, all 3 of them are slow growing, fairly chlorine tolerant, and typically cause disease by respiratory infection, so breathing in the aerosols. The Safe Drinking Water Act does not require health departments, does not require drinking water systems to monitor, measure, or control these. They don't have to look for it. They don't measure it. If they find it, they don't have to do anything about it. Chlorine itself we've been using it since 1908, New Jersey. I think Jersey City, New Jersey was the first to really start injecting it. But fundamentally, I mean, as a toxicologist, I'll tell you, it's a toxic substance we're pumping into our water.
Yeah.
Ostensibly at a low concentration, but enough to kill, keep the organisms under control. But it was put in the water to control cholera, E. coli, enteric organisms, stuff associated with poop, not stuff associated with respiratory disease. And frankly, those enteric organisms are wimps. They're easy to kill with chlorine. They die off at a heartbeat, and they don't amplify in the water. The conditions in your gut are very different from the conditions in your public water system. As bad as they may be, it's still not the right place. So chlorine and monochloramine are affected by the pH of the water, and when it gets into that aqueous solution, the higher the pH goes, so above about 7.6, 7.8, you really see the
Reduction
phase. Well, you see the phase of chlorine shift from hypochlorous acid, which is the biologically effective.
Yeah. That's what you want, right?
That's what you want.
Right.
That's it. Under acidic conditions, it's almost all in that phase.
Absolutely.
You get above 7.8 to 8, and you may only have 20, and then it rapidly drops off to maybe even 2% if you get up to pH of 9. So you may have a lot of chlorine, free chlorine in the water, but only 1% of it may be biologically effective. And so that's the big thing. And then when you try to remediate cooling towers and hot tubs, if you dump a bunch of chlorine in there, 200 part per million, it causes also all of this scale to shift and to become available. And you often jump the pH up. So you've got a lot of chlorine that in theory could be killing the organism, but you've also made it ineffective because you've also driven up the pH. So yeah, around 7.8 to 8 is the highest you want to be treating with chlorine. Monochloramine is a little less inhibited by the pH, but it still can be. Getting a pH of 8, 8.5 to 9 can certainly make it ineffective. So yeah, it's a complicated relationship, and ultimately measure, don't assume.
Do they use? I know you can get hypochlorous acid from salt and water and electricity, and I'm just wondering, do they use that at all for treating water systems in buildings or anything?
Typically, maybe a hot tub or a swimming pool.
Okay, gotcha.
See salt systems like that, but I don't see it produced for this because and I don't know why it may not be economically feasible or reliable, or just may not have been approved for drinking water. But yeah, it's mostly what we see is chlorine dioxide, monochloramine, or sodium hypochlorite, which disassociates into
one of the papers that you sent was very, very interesting. The one where I think you had this concept or study this concept of removing some of the oxygen from the water. And I was just wondering, is that commercialized, or has that been commercialized?
It's in the process. It's in the
Okay, cool.
process. So the concept that we're talking about here is that, Legionella is an obligate erode. It's got to have oxygen. It's not just
Okay.
water flowing through the pipes. It's dissolved oxygen in that water. In the Gulf of Mexico, when you don't have dissolved oxygen, they call it the dead zone for a reason. Fish and bacteria need it. Turns out Legionella, as well as non-tuberculous mycobacteria, they've got to have air. They have a certain. It's not a lot, but what we found is that if you can reduce the dissolved oxygen levels in water, and if it's inside of copper pipes, there's no new sources, and you can reduce that dissolved oxygen, you're able to basically inhibit the metabolic respiration of the bacteria, and it keeps it from growing. It doesn't kill it like a knife; it suffocates it.
Gotcha.
And then it turns out does it very, very effectively. Now, the technology to do that was not really available until about the year 2000. 3M came out with a product called a membrane contactor. So it's a gas transfer contactor that they use to either remove gases from fluids or inject gases into fluids. Just flip it around.
Yeah, gotcha.
And what you're doing there now, it turns out we really don't know how chlorine works. Been using it a long time, but the exact mechanism of how it kills or inhibits cells is not well understood. There's a lot of theories. Probably one or more of them is what's happening there. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're stopping its ability to metabolize, to take in food, to grow, to amplify, to reproduce, and you can do that by either chlorine treatment, which damages its cell membranes, or by just not having the oxygen in the water to begin with. And so that's what that theory is about. And, we've actually done some studies, some publications, and have run a year-long study in a building, and have a system that's ready to be installed. And we're still doing further studies on that. But yeah, it's one in which we don't have to add any chemicals.
Cool. Yeah, it's very cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, that would be nice if you can get that to work on a large scale. Let's go to the roundup, John. All right, I've got a text here I want to read to you here. Although I generally agree with most of your opinions, you seem to give some credibility that indoor exposure to stachy has the potential to cause toxicity symptoms. I haven't seen any conclusive evidence that this has actually happened. You said you had a few cases where occupants had mycotoxin-related health problems. Can you please describe your findings from these? Do you agree that the response to tacky growth is the same as to other mold types and that sampling is not necessary? It's a little long, but
90% of what he says, I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
That's Ed Light, by the way, so you know.
Of course. We
all love Ed.
Thanks for writing. I agree. It is probably an extremely rare event where mycotoxins may enter into this at all. One of the most likely contributing aspects that it can do, even at low levels, may be interference with the body's ability to generate immune cells. So dysfunction or reduction in the immune system, and thus the ability of a person to fight off other infections. And so, like I said, the one or two times where I could say this might have had an exposure issue related to mycotoxins, the person wasn't actually infected with any mold. It was actually due to a staph infection, a heart infection of a child, in which every wall in a home was contaminated, and the manufacturer of that home had actually come in and opened up wall cavities, pointed fans at them, and left them open for a week while the family was still in the home. The exposure was undeniably massive and long-term, and it ended up in the hospitalization of the child and illnesses of the family. Dermatitis is one of the other major symptoms that you should be seeing if you're seeing exposures? Very rarely. Every person in this home had severe dermatitis that began with that scenario of exposures. So that, I think, is kind of the bookend of extreme exposures. So really, I agree. I think it's rare and can be handled 100% of the time by simply dealing with the mold growth and the underlying water source.
Okay. Cliff, do you have any final?
Well, no, I just want to read one of the other comments from PK was that he wishes there was a mandate to clean cooling towers more frequently than once a year. Such a high rate of positivity for Legionella is found there. So.
Absolutely. Cooling tower are a great breeding ground for Legionella and other bacteria. OSHA actually recommends it twice a year. If we see it every 5 years, I'm frankly surprised. But yeah, physical cleaning and also protective measures for those doing the cleaning and ensuring that you're not exposing people around in the surrounding area, because that's often a very aerosol generating process. But yeah, cooling towers, they need to be I'll say cared for with a lot of love.
Now, this is kind of an off the wall,
Go ahead.
I guess, follow up. You know a lot about Legionella and you know a lot about water. Does Legionella have an adverse effect on aquatic life? You know, for instance, in an aquarium or pond or anything like that?
No, Legionella is one of those microbes that kind of gets its butt kicked in nature. It is the prey. It is eaten by amoeba and protozoa. But it kind of throws a boomerang into those organisms, because what it does is it can sometimes turn those organisms into baby making factories, and it actually infects those organisms and becomes virulent. So, but it's a minor player in the environment. We just make some synthetic artificial environments and water heaters and hot tubs and cooling towers that really favors them.
I've got two questions here. That one is kind of, you jogged my memory a little bit when you talked about people treating these cooling towers needing protection. There's few in the book. It says there's few data are available on personal exposures that have occurred during fungal remediation. My question is, why doesn't anybody study this, and what does the data we do have indicate?
The few studies I've seen have really been published by Phil Morey, and they were not pretty. The airborne concentrations within the containment areas were 10 to the 6 concentrations, millions of CFU per or spores per cubic meter. The remediation process in that, as we all know, aerosolizes and generates high concentrations within that containment area. I think it would be advisable for the remediation industry to delve into this. You know that respirators are not rated for microbial contaminants. They're rated for chemical contaminants. And, we didn't get into it today, but the, risk assessment matrix to determine what type of engineering controls or PPE you need, it really deserves an assessment to look at how are respirators, respiratory protection devices, whether it's a PAPR or an N95, how are they really rated? And are we really protecting ourselves and our workers when we go into these remediation projects?
I think the guidance is flawed in many of the remediation protocols, because a lot of them will have big red letters: do not introduce water, do not introduce water. So if you can't introduce water, they're using air or whatever to clean it up, and they're disturbing it. So I think in many situations, either misting the air or misting the surfaces or whatever before you remove it, I think would go very, very far.
Sometimes we do things during remediation you don't want to do on a normal basis because you have to.
Understood.
Sometimes I've actually done the experiment when they in the Florida Supreme Court building. They it's going to take them 6 months to get budgetary authority to do the remediation.
Right.
And the guy said, "Well, we can't get a hold of the antimicrobial paint." I said, "Put any paint over it."
Right.
Okay. And guess what? Any old house paint will cover it up, and you won't see it grow through for at least a few months.
Right.
And would thwart any sampling, even surface sampling. So, and it did mitigate things for a little while, at least until they got the money in to fix the problem. But yeah, I agree with you on that. People often take a little bit of information and extrapolate it far beyond where it's really reliable.
All right, I got two more here now. All right, I have to shift from my questions to the questions in the chat.
That's the
First-
important part, Jim.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. First is a comment. Respirator filters are rated for particulates.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Maybe I misunderstood. Most of what we're remediating when we do mold remediation or whatever is particulate, right? Is that, are you saying we're not sure if these are working on that type of particulate?
Well, depending on the size and depending on the VOCs, you've got odors. The other aspect that you're not looking at here are, so what are the fungi doing? They're growing on a surface, not growing on the surface, they're eating the surface. They're decomposing whatever is on that surface, whatever chemicals, flame retardants, metals. And so those are being mobilized into the substrate as well. So it's not just fungal hyphae and particles.
Okay.
And yes, that is correct. That respirators are rated towards certain size particles that may or may not have adsorbed chemicals and vaporous chemicals themselves. But they haven't really been tested against biological agents themselves, whether they're infectious or non-infectious or allergenic. The allergens themselves are often attached to hyphal fragments, which do they behave the same way? Maybe, maybe not. But we have assigned protection factors for PELs, for chemicals, for particles. We don't have the evidence to say that it is directly translated into microbial exposures. And often we don't even know what exposures we're dealing with.
Well, that's another issue. That's another. Now, the other question, since we're talking about what exposures we're having, since there is a continuing concern about airborne viruses, are there good methods now for measuring the concentration?
No.
That was easy.
No can be an entire sentence, yes.
Wow.
I measuring viruses in air carries with it so many problems. Our ability to quantify them, our ability to capture them and understand the efficiency of any sampling methodology are all, I'll say, good swags. Maybe a scientific wild ass guess, but not to the level of understanding what we need. So yeah, with viruses, I think we have been forced to a situation where we have to make assumptions and apply what we know about bacteria and other pathogens to the area of viruses. And if you think about it, viruses aren't even alive until they're inside the body.
You have time for one more?
Your show.
All right. We don't mind running over a little bit as long as our guests can stick around. One of my questions was that in the document, they say contaminated porous materials in HVAC systems must be removed to underlying bare metal and contaminated materials appropriately discarded. If the moisture issue is fixed, the materials are cleaned and coated, what's wrong with that?
Well, I'll say that first statement was in there from the original, and neither Jack or I felt that it was, appropriate to change that. I think in an ideal world, that is where we need to be. Then there's the practicality of, okay, well, what if you can't? I've dealt with that situation that's not in the realm of reality. What do you deal with it? The issue of cleaning and coating. Now, I've done some publications on this, done some studies. Essentially, if you have to clean porous internal duct liner, you are cutting the grass. You are not removing the mold. You are shaving off the top layer of material. And if you look at it, I looked under a microscope. The height. If you can imagine my finger as being a fiber, the hyphae would literally entwine around each of the fibers, and they're degrading the resin that's holding it together. So you're not pulling that hyphae off of those fibers at all. You're going to strip off the top layer. It's going to reduce the thermal capacity of the insulative capacity and rating of the remaining internal insulation. And you're going to leave a lot of loose fibers in there anyway, after any type of abrasive cleaning of porous liner. And we're talking line duct or duct board right now. Duct board, I would, if it wasn't for duct board, I probably wouldn't have a career. They should stop putting that stuff in, but until they do, we're going to deal with it. All right, so if you're going to call it remediation, let's talk about what remediation is. Remediation is the removal of contaminant sources. If you're going to clean as much as you can and coat over it, call that cleaning and coating. Call that mitigation. Call that interim measures. Call it something except remediation.
Okay.
And there's been instances where at least portions of the HVAC system, portions of equipment and materials, load-bearing walls, okay, that couldn't meet criteria. We're going to call that managed in place, and we're going to keep an eye on it down the road. But don't portray something as being remediated to a level that I would require in a hospital or a pediatric cancer ward. Don't call that in charge the same as you would for going in and removing the gross material and coating it as best you can and hope it doesn't come back. Because as Colonel Feely told me in the 1st Armored Division, hope's not a method, son. So let's have some, assurances. And if you're, understand everything can't be remediated, but let's be straightforward with people and not oversell what's being offered.
All right. Cliff, any final thoughts or questions?
No, perfect place to end
I
it.
just want to thank Dr. David Krause for joining us. I knew it would be a good one, and I was not disappointed. I want to thank my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, and John. You got to have faith. Back at the controls for a week. Thank you, John. Without a glitch, great job. Of course, I want to thank our loyal audience and our sponsors. David, thanks again for joining us, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk soon.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Love to do it some other time.
All right. This is Radio Joe Hughes. Oh, by the way, next week we've got Watley. Mark Watley will be joining us again. So we're going to do a restoration show next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.